The courthouse parking lot buzzed with the usual Monday morning rush. Lawyers in crisp suits, officers exchanging greetings, clerks balancing coffee and files. Judge Malcolm Reed stepped out of his black Mercedes, adjusting the cuffs of his gray suit. His docket was full, his mind already on the promotion hearing scheduled later that week. Across the street, Officer Brian Keller leaned against his patrol car, sipping coffee. He noticed the Mercedes first, sleek and spotless, parked neatly in a reserved space. Then he saw Malcolm, a tall, composed black man in a tailored suit, unlocking the car. Keller frowned. The man didn't look familiar. Not the kind of person he usually saw driving a car like that near the courthouse at dawn. Keller set down his cup and started walking. "Excuse me, sir," he called out sharply. "Is this your vehicle?" Malcolm turned, calm and polite. "It is. Mind showing me some ID? We've had a few reports of stolen cars in the area." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Reports? Or assumptions?" The officer's jaw tightened. "Just doing my job." People walking by began slowing down, sensing tension. Keller's hand hovered near his holster, not drawn, but close enough to send a message. Malcolm stood perfectly still, the morning sun glinting off the polished hood of his car. "I suggest you check your facts before escalating this further," Malcolm said evenly. "Oh, I'll check," Keller shot back. "Something tells me this car doesn't belong to you." Malcolm reached into his briefcase and pulled out a leather folder. "You're right," he said quietly. "Technically, it belongs to the state." He opened it, revealing his judicial badge. Judge Malcolm Reed, Superior Court. Keller froze. He didn't know it yet. But the man he just humiliated was the one deciding whether he'd get promoted next week. Malcolm Reed had spent more than 25 years inside courtrooms. First as a public defender, then as a prosecutor, and eventually as one of the youngest judges to sit on the state's Superior Court. He had built his career not on sharp words or political maneuvering, but on quiet steadiness, the kind of presence that could calm a room with a single look. That morning, he had left his suburban home early, hoping to reach his chambers before the chaos of the day began. His wife, Camille, had handed him his travel mug with a familiar reminder. "Don't skip breakfast again. The courthouse doesn't need a hungry judge." He had smiled, kissed her cheek, and promised he wouldn't. But by the time he parked his car downtown, the coffee had gone cold and his stomach was empty. The Mercedes wasn't brand new, but it was well cared for. A symbol of years of hard work, late nights, and difficult choices. It had been a small celebration for his 50th birthday, something he'd bought not out of vanity, but out of quiet pride. He knew what it looked like, though. In certain neighborhoods, in certain eyes, it wasn't just a car. It was a question, a challenge. How did he afford that? Does it really belong to him? Malcolm had grown used to those looks long ago. Even as a judge, he'd been followed around high-end stores, mistaken for a driver, asked to wait outside at restaurants. Each time he met it with composure. He'd been taught early that dignity was the best form of resistance. But every so often, the weight of it pressed harder. He had seen how perception could twist the truth inside his own courtroom. How a name, a face, a shade of skin could change the tone of an officer's report, or the leniency in a sentence. He had watched young black men plead guilty just to end the humiliation of being disbelieved. That morning, as he drove through the tree-lined streets toward the courthouse, he wasn't thinking about any of that. He was thinking about his docket. 3 criminal appeals, 2 civil disputes, and 1 administrative hearing about a police officer's promotion. Officer Brian Keller. He remembered the file clearly. 8 years on the force. Mostly clean record, commendations for community service, but also 2 prior warnings. One for aggressive conduct during a routine stop, another for an unprofessional outburst in a traffic dispute. The committee reviewing Keller's promotion was scheduled to meet later that week, and Malcolm, as one of the senior judges, would chair the session. He had already made a note to raise questions about Keller's judgment under pressure. Now, standing beside his car in the parking lot, he watched that same officer stride toward him, suspicion etched across his face. "Is this your car?" Keller asked again, his tone edged with authority. Malcolm kept his expression neutral. "It is. License and registration, please." Malcolm hesitated. "On what grounds?" Keller gave a short, clipped answer. "We've had theft reports matching this vehicle's description." Step away from the car. There it was, the familiar sting beneath the politeness. Malcolm exhaled slowly. He could have ended it right there by flashing his credentials. But something inside him stopped. He wanted to see how far this officer would go. "Officer," he said calmly, "I assure you this car is not stolen. My identification is inside my briefcase. You're free to confirm anything you need." Keller narrowed his eyes. Funny how thieves always say that. A few people passing through the lot slowed down, watching the exchange. Malcolm could feel their stares on his back, the tension thickening in the air. He thought of his father, a school principal who had taught him to stand tall in moments like this. Never let anger take away your power, his father used to say. They expect you to break. So don't. He stepped back, hands visible, voice even. Do what you need to do, officer. Keller walked around the car, peering into the windows. You mind popping the trunk? Malcolm folded his arms. Unless you have a warrant or probable cause, no. The defiance seemed to annoy Keller. He reached for his radio. Dispatch, I'm at the courthouse lot. Got a possible vehicle theft in progress. Suspects being uncooperative. Uncooperative. The word made Malcolm's jaw tighten. It was the kind of word that had filled police reports for decades, often before anyone had done anything wrong. When backup arrived minutes later, the supervising officer recognized Malcolm instantly. Judge Reed? Sir, is everything all right? Keller turned, confused. You know him? The supervisor's tone sharpened. That's Judge Reed. He's on the state bench. Keller's expression fell, his mouth opening slightly. He looked from the supervisor to Malcolm, realization flooding his face. Your Honor, I didn't realize. Malcolm simply opened his briefcase and handed over his credentials. Next time, he said quietly, realize before you act. The supervisor began apologizing profusely. Keller stood frozen, his authority evaporating in the morning sun. I suggest, Malcolm said evenly, that you take note of this encounter. It may come up again sooner than you think. He closed his briefcase, adjusted his tie, and walked toward the courthouse steps without another word. Inside, the marble corridors were cool and quiet. As he entered his chambers, his clerk, Denise, looked up from her desk. Morning, Judge. Everything okay? He gave her a small smile. Just an unexpected start to the day. She laughed lightly. Isn't that every Monday? He nodded but said nothing more. As he sat behind his desk, his mind was already elsewhere. Not on the case files in front of him, but on the look of disbelief on Keller's face. He thought about the irony. The very man who had doubted his right to his own car would soon be standing before him, hoping for a promotion that depended on judgment, integrity, and restraint. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. The law, he thought, had a strange way of creating its own justice. Sometimes all you had to do was let time deliver it. He didn't plan revenge. That wasn't his way. But he did believe in accountability. Not the kind that destroys, but the kind that teaches. And when the promotion hearing arrived, he would make sure Officer Keller learned exactly what kind. The next morning was supposed to be routine. Judge Malcolm Reed's schedule started with a short civil hearing before lunch, followed by a meeting about the police department's internal promotions. He had already gone through the files, one of which, ironically, belonged to Officer Brian Keller. Keller's file had caught his attention because it read like a coin toss. Commendable field reports on one side, impulsive conduct warnings on the other. A man with potential but lacking discipline. Someone who could either rise or implode under pressure. Malcolm had written a note in the margin. Evaluate temperament under stress. Now, as fate would have it, he was watching that temperament unfold in real time. Keller had called in backup, but none had arrived yet. The courtyard outside the courthouse had grown quiet, the air thick with unease. Malcolm stood beside his car unflinching, his voice calm as ever. Officer Keller, he said evenly, you are detaining me without probable cause. You understand that? Keller's tone was clipped. You can argue probable cause when we're done, sir. Right now I need to confirm your story. My story? Malcolm raised an eyebrow. You've made quite an assumption for a man who hasn't even asked my name. I'll ask for ID when I see fit. Then let me make this clear, Malcolm said, his voice steady but colder now. You are making a mistake. Keller's hand rested near his belt again. You can cooperate, and this'll be over fast. Malcolm met his gaze. Cooperation doesn't mean submission, officer. The exchange was quiet, but it had gravity. People walking by slowed, sensing the friction. A woman standing near the steps whispered to her coworker, Isn't that Judge Reed? The whisper carried. Keller heard it and hesitated. Malcolm saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, brief, almost imperceptible. But it passed. Keller's pride overruled his caution. Sir, he said, louder now, I'm asking you one last time. Do you have proof that this vehicle belongs to you? Malcolm exhaled slowly. I do, inside my briefcase. May I reach for it? Keller nodded stiffly, hands still hovering over his holster. Go ahead, slowly. Malcolm bent down, opened the briefcase, and pulled out his registration, his driver's license, and a small black leather folder. He held them out without flinching. Keller took the papers, glancing at the registration first. His brow furrowed as he saw the name printed clearly, Malcolm R. Reed. He looked back up at the man standing before him, his authority faltering just slightly. "You're saying you're Judge Reed?" he asked uncertainly. Malcolm's tone was razor-sharp now. "No, officer. I'm telling you I am Judge Reed." Before Keller could answer, another voice cut through the tension. "Brian, what the hell are you doing?" It was Lieutenant Carla Simmons, Keller's supervisor, just arriving from the lot across the street. Her eyes darted from Keller's stance to Malcolm's face, and then widened with instant recognition. "Judge Reed." "My apologies, sir. I didn't realize—" Malcolm turned to her calmly. Apparently neither did he. Keller took a small step back, face flushed. "Ma'am, I thought—" The vehicle matched a bolo description. "I was just—" Simmons held up a hand. "Enough. You didn't verify before escalating?" Keller stammered. I followed protocol." Malcolm's voice was steady, though his eyes were cold. "Protocol? Tell me, Lieutenant. Is it standard practice for an officer to accuse someone of theft without running a plate or requesting identification first?" Simmons shook her head, embarrassment etched into her features. "No, Your Honor, it's not. This will be reviewed internally." Malcolm gave a curt nod. "Good. Because I suspect this isn't the first time his protocol has gotten him into trouble." Keller's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Simmons turned to him sharply. "Apologize now." Keller swallowed hard. "Your Honor, I made an error in judgment. I didn't realize—" Malcolm cut him off with quiet precision. "You didn't realize that a black man in a suit could own a car like this. That's the realization you missed, officer." The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the bystanders who had gathered around seemed frozen, uncertain whether to move or stay. Keller shifted awkwardly, unable to meet Malcolm's gaze. Finally, Malcolm gathered his papers, placed them back into his briefcase, and straightened his tie. His voice was calm again, but there was steel beneath it. "Officer Keller, I'll see you again soon." Keller blinked. "Sir?" Malcolm looked him in the eye. "You'll understand when the time comes." He turned toward the courthouse steps, the crowd parting silently to let him pass. The sound of his shoes against the concrete echoed like punctuation, deliberate, final. Inside, the clerk at the front desk looked up, startled. "Everything okay out there, Judge?" Malcolm gave a short nod. "It will be." He made it to his chambers and sat down slowly. For the first time that morning, he felt the quiet tremor of adrenaline under his skin. Not fear, anger maybe, or exhaustion. He wasn't sure which. He glanced at the promotion review file sitting on the corner of his desk. "Officer Brian Keller. Same name, same department." It was almost poetic. Malcolm leaned back in his chair and exhaled. The law had many tools: justice, punishment, mercy. But time was its own kind of justice. That afternoon, as the courthouse settled into its rhythm, Malcolm reviewed case notes, presiding over hearings with his usual composure. Yet every so often, his mind drifted back to the parking lot. The flash of arrogance in Keller's eyes. The instant it turned to fear. The way authority could shift in a heartbeat. He didn't intend to humiliate the man when the promotion hearing came. That wasn't who he was. But he would make sure the lesson sank deep enough to change something. Because one thing Malcolm Reed had learned over decades on the bench was that justice didn't always need a gavel. Sometimes all it took was a moment of clarity and the courage to hold the mirror steady. A week later, the conference room on the top floor of the courthouse was unusually still. Every detail had been arranged for the promotion board's quarterly session. Folders lined in neat rows, a flag behind the long mahogany table, pitchers of water sweating onto white napkins. Judge Malcolm Reed sat at the center seat, flanked by 2 senior administrators and a representative from the city's police commission. His expression was composed, unreadable. Only Denise, his longtime clerk, might have noticed the faint tightening at the corner of his mouth when the door opened, and Officer Brian Keller stepped inside. Keller's uniform looked immaculate, pressed to perfection. His hair was trimmed short, his shoes shined, but the confidence he'd practiced in the mirror that morning faltered the moment his eyes met Malcolm's. He froze for a heartbeat before managing a stiff nod. "Officer Keller," said the commissioner, motioning toward the chair opposite the panel. "Thank you for coming." Keller sat down carefully, the folder in his hands trembling just slightly. He could feel Malcolm's gaze. Calm, steady, unblinking. The commissioner began with formalities, listing Keller's years of service, his commendations, his training credentials. Then came the pivot everyone expected. Before we begin the interview portion, Judge Reed, you had questions regarding Officer Keller's record? Malcolm's voice was low but clear. Yes. He opened the folder before him, flipping past the typed evaluations to a handwritten note in the margin. His own. Evaluate temperament under stress. Officer Keller, he said, eyes still on the page. You've received positive reviews for field performance, yet there are notations of impulsive judgment. 2018, 2021, and most recently a verbal warning 6 months ago. Tell us what you've learned from those incidents. Keller swallowed. Your Honor, I've learned to slow down, to assess before reacting. I've taken additional de-escalation courses and… Good, Malcolm interrupted gently, finally looking up. Then perhaps you can tell me how you apply that lesson when faced with someone who doesn't fit your expectations. The room seemed to shrink. The commissioner glanced between them, sensing an undercurrent but unsure of its source. Keller's throat tightened. I'm not sure I follow, sir. Malcolm leaned back, folding his hands. Let me clarify. Suppose you encounter a person, law-abiding, polite, who happens to challenge your assumptions. Do you rely on evidence or instinct? Keller's jaw flexed. He knew exactly what this was about now. Evidence, Your Honor. Always? Yes, sir. Malcolm held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. That's a start. The commissioner continued the questioning. Community involvement, procedural integrity, leadership goals. Keller answered as best he could. But his focus kept drifting back to Malcolm. Every question from the judge seemed double-edged, clean on the surface yet heavy with subtext. When it was over, the commissioner thanked him and asked him to wait outside while the panel deliberated. Keller rose, his chair scraping softly against the floor. Before he turned to leave, Malcolm spoke again. One more thing, Officer Keller. Keller stopped. In your application, Malcolm said, you wrote that you aspire to lead by example. Do you still stand by that? Yes, sir. Then let me offer you one. Their eyes met, judge and officer. The balance reversed. Leadership begins the moment you recognize your own bias and choose humility instead of denial, Malcolm said quietly. Some lessons arrive at inconvenient times. How you respond to them determines whether you deserve the responsibility you seek. Keller nodded slowly. Yes, Your Honor. It wasn't defiance this time. It was understanding, edged with regret. Very well, Malcolm said. You may step out. When the door closed behind him, the room exhaled. The commissioner turned toward Malcolm. Was that about something specific? Malcolm tapped the file once. Let's say I've recently observed Officer Keller's decision-making under stress firsthand. The others waited, sensing there was more he wasn't saying. Malcolm didn't elaborate. My recommendation, he continued, is to defer the promotion for review after additional training. The potential is there, but judgment must match it. No one argued. The vote was unanimous. Outside the conference room, Keller sat in the hallway, staring at the floor tiles. He'd known the decision the moment he saw Malcolm behind that table. Still, hearing the words felt heavier than he expected. He wasn't angry. Not anymore. Just quiet. As he stood to leave, the door opened. Malcolm stepped out alone, his robe draped over one arm, the folder closed in his hand. Officer Keller, he said. Keller turned. Your Honor? I'm not here to embarrass you, Malcolm said softly. But I do hope you remember that morning. I already do, Keller replied, voice low. And I'm sorry. I can't take it back, but I can make sure it never happens again. Malcolm studied him for a moment. The defensiveness was gone. What remained was the raw discomfort of a man seeing himself clearly for the first time. Then start there, Malcolm said. That's what accountability looks like. He extended his hand. Keller hesitated, then shook it. The gesture was simple, but it carried more weight than any reprimand could. Later that afternoon, Malcolm returned to his chambers. Denise handed him the finalized paperwork from the board. Promotion deferred pending review, she read aloud. Think he'll learn from it? Malcolm nodded. I hope so. He looked out the tall window overlooking the courthouse steps, where a week earlier he'd stood accused beside his own car. The same space now gleamed in the afternoon light, quiet and unassuming. Justice, he thought, didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered, steady, measured, and fair. 3 months passed quietly after the hearing. The city slipped into its usual rhythm of news cycles and deadlines, and Officer Brian Keller's name stopped circulating in departmental whispers. For most people, the parking lot incident had faded, another near-forgotten moment in a long chain of routine days. But for Keller, it hadn't left his mind for a single one. Every shift, every call, every conversation since that morning had carried an echo of Judge Malcolm Reed's words. Leadership begins the moment you recognize your own bias At first, the sentence felt like an indictment. Over time, it became a mirror. Keller began to notice how quickly he'd once judged people, not just by race but by clothes, speech, posture, even the car they drove. He'd always told himself he treated everyone fairly, but fairness wasn't just about rules. It was about perception. And perception, he realized, had been his blind spot. He requested extra de-escalation sessions and volunteered for a community outreach program he'd once dismissed as PR fluff. It was awkward at first, sitting in a church basement with teenagers who eyed his uniform with open distrust, but he kept showing up. Over time, conversations grew easier. He didn't talk about the incident, but the lessons from it shaped everything he did. When a young black kid told him, "You cops always think we're up to something," Keller didn't flinch or defend himself. He just nodded and said, "I used to think that too. I was wrong." The honesty startled the room. For the first time, he wasn't talking at people. He was talking with them. Meanwhile, Judge Reed went on with his work, as he always did. From the outside, he was the same man. Steady, precise, deeply respected. But inside, something had shifted for him too. That day in the parking lot had reminded him that progress was fragile. That power could still bend toward prejudice no matter how high a person climbed. He'd spent years fighting injustice from the bench, believing education and experience could reshape the system. But standing beside his car that morning, reduced to a suspect in his own courthouse, had been a sobering reminder of how much remained unchanged. Yet the way things had unfolded afterward, calmly, through discipline instead of rage, reaffirmed his faith in the slow, deliberate path of justice. He hadn't needed to destroy Keller's career to prove a point. He'd needed to teach one. Months later, an email arrived from the police department. Keller had completed his retraining and was recommended for reinstatement on the promotion list. Attached was a short personal note. "Your Honor, I owe you an apology, but also my thanks. You were right. Humility doesn't come naturally to all of us. I thought the badge made me immune to mistakes. It didn't. The lesson you gave me that day, I needed it more than I knew. Respectfully, Brian Keller." Malcolm read it twice before setting it down. There was no bitterness in the message, only honesty. He smiled faintly, the kind of small smile that carried relief more than pride. Later that week, during a civic awards luncheon, Malcolm crossed paths with Keller again. The officer was there as part of a community policing panel, standing at the back of the hall in his dress uniform. Their eyes met across the crowd. This time, Keller didn't look nervous. He nodded respectfully, and Malcolm returned it. Nothing dramatic, no words needed. Just mutual acknowledgement between two men who had shared a hard truth. After the speeches ended, Keller made his way over. "Your Honor," he said, extending his hand. "Officer Keller," Malcolm replied, shaking it firmly. "I hear you've been keeping busy." Keller chuckled lightly. "Busy trying to be better. Turns out that's a full-time job." Malcolm's smile deepened. "It usually is." They talked briefly, about the outreach program, about the department's new training initiatives. Keller mentioned how he'd been asked to help lead workshops on bias recognition. "Feels strange," he admitted. "A few months ago, I was the one who needed the class." "That might be why you're the right person to teach it," Malcolm said. "Experience has a way of making lessons real." Keller nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You know, that day, I thought you were going to ruin my career." Malcolm tilted his head. "I could have, but that wouldn't have changed your mind. And changing minds," he said quietly, "is the harder, more important work." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was the kind that comes when things finally make sense. Later, as Malcolm left the hall, he paused near the steps. The same kind of steps where everything had begun months earlier. The sun had set, leaving streaks of deep orange over the city skyline. He took a slow breath, feeling something like peace settle in. For years, he'd seen justice as something measured in verdicts and sentences, in right and wrong etched onto paper. But now he understood it could also live in smaller, quieter places. In one changed heart, in one honest apology, in one man deciding to do better the next day than he did the last. As he walked toward his car, he noticed Keller holding the door open for a woman leaving the building. It was a small act, but something about it, the ease, the lack of pretense, made Malcolm smile again. In the end, both men had carried the weight of that parking lot with them, one as a reminder of restraint, the other as a measure of growth, and maybe that was how justice truly worked. Not through revenge or humiliation, but through reflection, accountability, and the quiet transformation that came when truth was finally seen for what it was. Malcolm unlocked his car and slid behind the wheel. The same black sedan that had sparked the whole misunderstanding now glinted under the streetlight. He rested his hands on the steering wheel for a moment, thinking about how absurd it all seemed in hindsight, and yet how necessary it had been. He started the engine, checked the rearview mirror, and merged into traffic. Another day would come, another docket, another set of faces waiting for judgment. But tonight, at least, he allowed himself a rare feeling of satisfaction. Because sometimes justice didn't have to thunder through a courtroom. Sometimes it arrived quietly. One conversation, one lesson, one second chance at a time.